Now you want to take and put your hinges in your aileron. And again, they just press right in. So there's the hinges. Make sure you're oriented. When I first cut these out, I made a little marking on the actual foam, and I can just barely see it through the covering, so I know what side this is and what direction is up. And now it's just a matter of fitting the aileron in to make sure that these openings are correct. If they're not, which these aren't, we'll need to enlarge the holes a little bit. And we'll try it again. Okay, now we're getting there. And I still need to enlarge the one on the end here. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, looks like it's going to fit. And then you'll want to slowly just work your hinges in till the hinges rest. You'll see there's a where the actual hinge is will only want to rest. You can only go so far as to how far you can push it in, then that hinge will rest against the foam under the place, and it'll leave a little gap. And as you can see, there's a gap right there, and that gives that aileron room to move. This moves nice and freely. It catches just a tiny bit on the edges. That's to be expected. You can move it around just a tiny little bit so it doesn't bind. But that's in. Now we'll go back. I'll show you how to epoxy these in. There's a trick to epoxying the hinges in, so you don't get epoxy on the hinges, and if you do, there's even a way to make it so the epoxy, when it sets up, it doesn't freeze the hinge into place. So that aileron's done. We'll go ahead and go to the other side and get that one done, and then we'll go ahead and epoxy them in. Now that you spent a couple minutes getting the ailerons fitted with the hinges, it's now time to epoxy them in. And one trick I learned in model railroading when I was gluing track down to keep things from sticking is you don't really want to get epoxy into the hinges. And what I use, it's Labelle 107 medium purpose plastic compatible oil, and you just dab a little bit into the hinges, and what that'll do is if any epoxy gets in there, it won't stick to that piece of plastic. And go ahead, and if you have that, make sure you use plastic compatible. If you use petroleum based oils of any type, it'll eventually eat through that plastic. It'll make it soft and crumbly over several years. So what I do is I just dab all of the hinges with that oil, and that'll keep it from sticking. The other thing is I use 30-minute epoxy when I put in the hinges. 5-minute for me sets up too quickly because you'll need to put epoxy both in these openings and in the openings in the wings. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and finish off putting oil on all the hinges, mix up some epoxy, and I'll show you how I put the epoxy in there, and so you don't get hardly any epoxy that oozes out. With the epoxy mixed up, what I like to do, the way I get epoxy into these openings, is I use just a piece of plastic, cut with a little bit of a round shape to the end of it, about the width of the hinge, and I coat that with epoxy. And again, I'm using 30-minute epoxy, and I just start shoving that down into the opening, trying to get as much as I can in there, working it around inside there. clean up your excess, and I'll go back and I'll wipe this all clean, and I'll show you what I use to clean epoxy off with. That works really great. But go ahead and get that epoxy down in that opening. Don't be afraid to get a bunch in there now, because we can clean it up later. And you want to do this both to the aileron and to the inside of the wing area. Well, I went ahead and put the epoxy in the ailerons and cleaned them up and pushed the hinges in. And then I went ahead and I filled these 3 holes by using this, pushing the epoxy down in there. And we have excess, and just take a cloth, paper towel, just wipe off the glob of extra for right now. Once you do that, go back, and I use rubbing alcohol, and that takes epoxy right off. And it cleans the surface, doesn't leave any residue. Make sure you clean your hands first if you have any epoxy on them, so that way you don't touch your wing and get epoxy someplace that you don't know. And just take your alcohol and wipe the surface clean, and when you're ready to go ahead and mount the ailerons. And what's nice about doing it this way versus trying to put epoxy on these hinges themselves, if you were to put epoxy on these hinges, when you go to push them in, that excess epoxy will push out into the hinge area. If you do it this way, the epoxy is already pressed down in there, and as you push the hinges in, it forces the epoxy down inside there more. One thing you want to do is make sure you don't have any extra oil that you put on the hinges. If it's ran down anywhere, make sure you wipe that clean, or the epoxy will not stick to that plastic. Just make sure they're clean. Make sure you're oriented properly. Again, I have my markings, so I know which way my hinge goes, my aileron goes. And now it's just a matter of lining them up to the holes and forcing it down in there. And make sure that it moves freely and that it's set. And that's it. And because we're using 30-minute epoxy, one thing I usually do is after I get the hinges in, the aileron in, I'll let this set up for a while before I do anything else to the wing. So I'll let this sit for a half hour to an hour, and during that time I'll come back down to the shop and I'll move it around just to make sure that if there was any excess epoxy that touched anywhere, that I keep moving it, and it keeps it from freezing up. So that's one down. We'll do the other one, and we'll probably let this set up overnight, and then I'll come back, and the next thing we'll do is we'll cut out the opening for the servos. I need to solder longer leads to the servos. That's the only problem with those Hectronic servos, is the leads aren't very long, so we'll need to extend the leads to the middle of the wing, and we'll mount those. We'll also need to mount a horn for the servo, for the aileron, and I'll show you how to mount the horn, epoxy that in, and then we'll also build the linkage that links the servo to the aileron, and how that's done. But that's it for mounting ailerons. It's real simple, and if you follow this tip, you'll have friction-free aileron movement. They won't get locked up. They'll be in there nice and strong.